In the brittle summer of 1878, the farmlands of Kansas whispered of things that refused to be tilled under or buried deep. Among faded ledgers and forgotten sermons lies a single case, rarely spoken, almost never written. It was the tale of 4 brothers, born to an ordinary family whose names have long been scrubbed from parish records, as if erasure itself might guard the living from memory. The fragments that survive do not agree on detail. Some insist the boys were born under the same roof within a span of 4 years. Others claim they arrived together on one stormlit night. What all accounts agree upon is the mark. Each brother, it is said, bore a strange seal upon the skin, identical in shape, placed not by accident of birth, but by a hand unknown to medicine. Traveling physicians dismissed the story as frontier folklore. Clergymen called it blasphemy, refusing to let the matter enter their official archives. And yet, diaries hidden in attic trunks and unsigned letters tell of how these boys grew, how their presence warped the rhythm of village life, until even hardened farmers crossed themselves when their shadows passed. This is their forbidden record. At first, the brothers appeared no different from other children raised among the wheat fields and dust-blown fences of Kansas. They worked the soil, tended livestock, and recited their prayers beside their weary parents. Yet, as the years unfolded, the first unease settled like a shadow over the farm. The eldest, Matthew, displayed a strength that far outstripped his years. At only 9, he lifted sacks of grain that seasoned men struggled to carry. Neighbors whispered that his grip left bruises even when meant in play. The second, Elias, startled the household with his uncanny senses. He could hear conversations whispered through wooden walls, or fix his gaze upon a bird alighting in distant fields, describing its feathers in precise detail. The third, Jonah, frightened the midwife most of all. A boy who fell from a loft and broke his arm was said to recover within hours under Jonah's touch. Sick calves revived after he pressed his hands upon their shivering hides. Some called it a blessing. Others muttered the darker word, witchcraft. But it was the youngest, Samuel, who unsettled even his brothers. His dreams spilled into waking life. He would rise before dawn to speak of events not yet occurred, barn fires, quarrels between neighbors, a stillborn calf, and without fail, the day would bring them true. His eyes, villagers claimed, never seemed fixed upon the present, but upon something just beyond. Together, they formed a bond so close it seemed unnatural. They moved in rhythm, finishing one another's thoughts, turning their heads in unison when strangers approached. Mothers pulled their children indoors when the 4 passed by. For though no crime had yet touched their hands, fear had already chosen its vessel. By the spring of 1886, the farm was no longer regarded as part of the community, but as something set apart, as though a shadowed fence had risen around it that no hand could cross. The brothers, now nearly grown, walked through town with a silence that pressed on the chest of every onlooker. No fist had been raised, no law broken, yet a mounting dread clung to their presence like dust on old rafters. Livestock began to die without cause. A line of cattle, healthy in the evening, would be found stiff and breathless by dawn. Barn fires sparked without lightning or lamp, consuming dry timber in minutes. A farmer's boy who mocked the youngest brother was thrown from his horse the following week, his neck broken upon a stone. Each incident, taken alone, might have passed as cruel chance, but together they painted a darker design. The townsfolk began to murmur of a shared mind, for the brothers seemed to move as a single creature split into 4 bodies. If Matthew turned his head, Elias would follow an instant later. If Samuel laughed, the others smiled, though no jest had been spoken. It was not fraternity, but symmetry, too perfect to be natural. Dr. William Harker, a physician sent from Topeka, was summoned to examine them. He recorded that their pulses aligned, beating in unison though he listened with 4 different instruments. "It is as if one heart governs them all," he wrote in a letter never formally published. When Sunday bells rang, the pews nearest the brothers sat empty, parents pulling their children away with trembling hands. Some claimed their hymns faltered, their voices deepening into tones that did not belong to boys of their age. Fear no longer whispered in corners. It walked openly in the daylight, carried in every glance cast toward the 4 who had become both the town's burden and its curse. The dread that had once lived in whispers found its voice one Sunday morning when the brothers took their places. In the back pew of the small white church at the edge of town, the air inside was heavy, as though the timbers themselves strained to keep from bowing under the burden of unease. Reverend Claiborne, a man weathered by both drought and faith, began his sermon on the trials of Job, urging the congregation to endure suffering with patience. At first, nothing was amiss, but as the Reverend's words filled the room, the brothers lowered their heads in unison, lips moving soundlessly. Then, in a single breath, they began to speak, not in English, nor in any tongue known to the plainsfolk. It was a chant, low and rolling, as if the earth beneath the pews had found a voice and chosen theirs as its vessel. Mothers clutched their children. Men rose, uncertain whether to flee or silence the boys. The sound grew, layer upon layer, until the church's oil lamps flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows across the plaster walls. Several claimed later that the stained glass window above the altar seemed to twist, the painted saints bending away from the 4 boys, as though recoiling from some unholy truth. Reverend Claiborne staggered mid-sermon, his face ashen, and fell to the floor. The congregation rushed forward, yet none dared approach the brothers who continued their chant, eyes glazed as if fixed on some distant horizon. A woman screamed that her dead husband's name had been spoken in their chorus. Another swore she saw a vision of locusts swarming over the wheat fields. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound ceased. The brothers raised their heads in perfect harmony, their eyes glinting with a light not wholly their own. Silence drowned the room. The Reverend never recovered consciousness that day. By dusk, word spread through every farm and homestead. The boys were no longer to be regarded as children nor even as men. They had crossed some invisible threshold, and what remained could not be trusted within walls consecrated to God. That night, the church bells tolled without a hand upon the rope. After the church incident, the town elders gathered in the dim, back room of the grain mill, where the smell of dust and rusted iron hung thick in the air. Fear had hardened into resolve. Something they agreed must be done. The 4 brothers could not be permitted to walk together as one. Their bond was unnatural, a threat to both faith and order. The solution, though brutal, seemed to them the only way forward. They must be separated. Dr. William Harker, still unsettled by his earlier examinations, was summoned again. He argued that the boys be taken to Topeka or St. Louis, where men of science might study them properly. But the elders, pressed by trembling wives and frightened children, refused. "They are not for study," one man spat. "They are for containment." The attempt began at dawn. Matthew and Elias were sent with 2 farmers in a wagon bound north. Jonah and Samuel were to remain behind under the watch of the Reverend's assistant. The brothers did not resist, not with fists or words. Instead, they watched one another with a stillness so profound that those present swore they saw a silent conversation pass between their eyes. Within the hour, calamity followed. The wagon's horses, steady beasts long used to hard roads, reared and bolted without cause, overturning the cart and breaking the leg of one farmer. In the church vestry, Samuel began to scream, not in pain, but as if his lungs carried the anguish of his brother miles away. Jonah collapsed beside him, blood seeping from his nose, though no wound could be found. Witnesses fled in terror. By nightfall, the four were brought back together, for none dared risk further wrath. When reunited, the brothers touched hands, and the strange afflictions ceased. The farmer's leg healed in ways that defied explanation, bone mending in days rather than months. Even Dr. Harker, who once sought to study them, admitted in a trembling whisper that the separation had stirred forces beyond medicine's reach. From that night onward, no one in town attempted to part the brothers again. Their unity had proven unbreakable, not by distance, nor by will of men, nor even by the ropes of mortal authority. To divide them was to invite disaster, and the people of Kansas learned to live beneath the weight of their presence. But the question remained. If they could not be separated, then what destiny had bound them so, and who or what claimed them as its own? By the autumn of 1887, the story of the four brothers had drifted far beyond the cracked fences and wheat fields of their Kansas town. Travelers carried whispers along the rail lines, embellishing each retelling with darker hues. Some said the E.I. boys were angels cast down for pride, others that they were children born of the devil himself. Few believed the accounts in full, but the tale was curious enough to summon a stranger. He arrived at dusk, stepping off the eastbound train in a long black coat that seemed to swallow the twilight. His name, given sparingly, was Professor Alistair Crow, a man who claimed to have studied rare phenomena across Europe: magnetism, mesmerism, even the uncharted reaches of the human mind. His eyes, pale as ash, unsettled those who dared meet them, as though he saw not the face, but the thoughts beneath. The townsfolk regarded him with suspicion, yet desperation outweighed mistrust. If anyone might rid them of their burden, it was this man of science, or sorcery, depending on who spoke. Lodged in the Reverend's vacant parsonage, Crow wasted no time. He sought the brothers, not with fear, but with a kind of fevered fascination. Their first meeting was said to silence even the crickets. The four stood together, hands loosely at their sides, watching the stranger as one body. Crow circled them slowly, murmuring in Latin and Greek, scribbling symbols into a small leather journal. Finally, he spoke. "You are not four. You are one. But whose hand wrote you so?" In the days that followed, he conducted what he called examinations. No restraints were used, none were needed. The brothers obeyed his commands as if guided by some invisible pact. They submitted to his strange devices: mirrors etched with unfamiliar runes, brass instruments that hummed when near their skin, vials of quicksilver that rippled without touch. Crow recorded feverishly, muttering that their pulses still aligned. Their thoughts still echoed. Yet unlike the fearful townsfolk, he did not shrink from their uncanny unity. Instead, he sought to draw it out, to test its boundaries. He asked Samuel of his visions, Jonah of his healing touch, Elias of his far-reaching senses, and Matthew of his impossible strength. The boys answered little, yet when they did, their voices carried the same cadence, the same unbroken rhythm. Some claimed the professor began to change. His face grew pale, his nights sleepless, his gaze hollow with wonder and dread. Others whispered that he had grown too close, that the brothers had begun to pull him into their unseen circle, making him less a man and more a fragment of themselves. And so the town waited, caught between fear of the boys and fear of the man who dared to study them. For if Crow truly unraveled their mystery, what truth might come forth, one that science itself had long refused to see? The parsonage windows were shuttered for 3 nights in a row, and a strange glow leaked through the cracks, sometimes red, sometimes white, sometimes flickering like a lantern drowned in water. The townsfolk crossed the street rather than walk past, muttering prayers beneath their breath. They said Professor Crow had begun the experiment. None dared to intervene. Inside, the air was thick with incense and chalk dust. Symbols were carved into the floorboards, precise circles overlapping like the gears of a hidden machine. At the center stood the four brothers, hands clasped, eyes half closed as if they were both awake and dreaming. Crow moved feverishly around, them adjusting brass instruments that clicked and hissed with unseen currents. "Unity is their curse," he whispered into his journal, "but unity is also the key, to unbind them. One must first understand the thread that ties their souls." The experiment began with sound. Crow brought forth a tuning fork, striking it against a steel plate until it sang. The note should have faded, but when held before the brothers, it deepened, multiplied, reverberating as though the air itself had become their instrument. The walls quaked. His hand trembled as he scribbled. "They do not hear, they resonate." Next came light. A lantern flame was placed before Samuel. Without touch, the fire bent toward his chest, flickering in rhythm with his heartbeat. Jonah reached out, and the flame swelled, brightening until the glass chimney cracked. Elias inhaled, and the fire dimmed, nearly extinguished, as though obeying the pull of his breath. Crow stared wide-eyed, muttering, "Energy? They command energy." But it was Matthew who unsettled him most. Bound by neither rope nor chain, the boy pressed his palm against the floor, and the chalk markings seemed to crawl, reshaping themselves into new patterns. Crow fell back, horrified to find his carefully drawn sigils altering without his will. The brothers opened their eyes then, and for the first time spoke to him in one voice. "You seek to divide what was never meant to be divided." The words froze him. His pen slipped from his hand. His carefully trained, rational mind fractured in that moment, torn between awe and terror. "What are you?" he demanded, voice breaking. The brothers tilted their heads in perfect harmony. "We are the question you cannot answer. We are the silence you cannot bear." Crow staggered back, clutching his temples as though their voice had burrowed inside his skull. He shouted at them to stop, but the air had already grown heavy, pressing against his chest, filling the room with a suffocating weight. One lamp burst, sending shards across the floor. Another sputtered out. When neighbors claimed to glimpse inside through a gap in the shutters, they swore they saw Crow suspended above the floor, thrashing as if caught in invisible threads. The brothers stood unmoving beneath him, their gazes fixed, their bodies glowing faintly with some inner fire. By dawn, the glow had vanished. The parsonage was still. The door swung open to reveal Crow sprawled on the floor, pale and trembling, his journal clutched tight against his chest. He never spoke of what he had seen in those final moments, save for one broken sentence. "They are not of us," and never were. The morning after Professor Crow's experiment, the town awoke to a silence that felt unnatural, as though the earth itself had chosen to withhold its voice. No birds sang, no wagons creaked down the dirt roads, and even the wind seemed reluctant to stir. The parsonage, where Crow had taken residence, stood as a dark monument, its windows shattered, its door ajar, and the faint smell of burnt oil clinging to the air. It was the children who first dared to peek inside, darting away with screams at what they saw. The professor seated in the corner, eyes wide open yet unseeing, his journal clutched to his chest. He breathed, shallow and ragged, but spoke no words. His once proud hands shook as if palsied, and when asked what had occurred, he only mouthed a single name: them. The four brothers were found in the churchyard, sitting quietly in a row upon the stone steps. Their expressions were calm, too calm, as if they were waiting. When approached, they neither resisted nor fled. They simply lifted their eyes in unison, and those who met their gaze turned pale, retreating without a word. It was said that to look into those eyes then was to see something vast, something no soul was meant to comprehend. Panic spread. Farmers abandoned their fields, mothers forbade their children from walking the streets, and even the reverend who had once preached compassion locked himself away, fasting and praying for deliverance. Rumors bloomed like weeds that the boys had killed the professor's mind, that they carried within them a plague of the spirit, that Kansas itself would be swallowed if they remained. Yet not all fled. A few stood guard at night, convinced that outsiders might come to steal the brothers away. Others whispered that the boys were chosen, that their presence was not curse, but prophecy. Divisions tore through the town, fear against fascination, faith against despair. As for Professor Crow, he was carried to the mill house where he lay muttering into the dark. His journal was taken from his hands, though many pages were smeared with ink and blood. What little could be read spoke of resonance, energy, and the thread of souls woven into one. But the final page contained only 4 words, scrawled so violently that the paper tore beneath the pen. They are not human. The declaration spread like fire. To some, it confirmed what they had long feared. To others, it was merely the ravings of a broken man. But no one could deny that something had shifted. The town, once merely wary, now lived in dread. By weeks, and wagons loaded with belongings rattled down the road, families fleeing eastward and westward. Those who stayed avoided the churchyard entirely, where the brothers still sat in silence, as if bound to one another by invisible chains. And though the town dwindled, the boys remained, watching, waiting. Their presence, unbroken, lingered like a shadow across the prairie. By the harvest of 1879, Cedar Grove had become a hollow shell of itself. Half the houses stood empty, shutters banging in the wind. The once proud wheat fields were untended, stalks withering in the sun. Only a handful of families remained, bound more by fear than loyalty. They lived with the knowledge that the 4 brothers were still there, silent, patient, and watching. The churchyard had become their sanctuary. For weeks they lingered on the stone steps, heads bowed as if in endless prayer. They did not eat, nor drink, yet their bodies did not waste. Away, at night their voices sometimes drifted across the fields, a low humming, mournful and unearthly, as though the earth itself groaned through them. Those who heard it claimed the sound slipped into their dreams, planting visions of fire, water, and endless darkness. Professor Crow, his mind broken but not his will, made one final attempt to understand. Shaking with fever and fright, he begged the townsfolk for one more chance. If they vanish without explanation, he warned, the world will forget and ignorance will breed again. But if we observe, if we record, we might glimpse the truth of what they are. His words fell on deaf ears. Most wanted only to see the boys gone. And then, without warning, the end came. On a moonless night, the sky split with a sound that was not thunder, but something older, deeper, a tearing of the heavens themselves. Light poured down upon the churchyard, a pale, cold radiance that turned every blade of grass silver. The townsfolk rushed from their homes, some dropping to their knees in prayer, others crying out in terror. The brothers rose as one. For the first time in months, they moved with purpose. Their hands reached toward the sky, fingers outstretched, as though grasping for something unseen. The glow wrapped around them like threads of glass, binding their forms in a luminous web. Their faces lifted, eyes gleaming with that same impossible light that had once unsettled the reverend and driven Crow to madness. "Do not watch," whispered an old woman, covering her granddaughter's eyes. But no one could look away. The humming began again, louder than ever, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Windows shattered, Cattle bellowed in panic, and the church bell tolled though no hand touched the rope. The four voices merged into one vast chord, a sound not meant for human ears. Some collapsed, clutching their skulls. Others stood transfixed, tears streaking their cheeks, though they could not say why. And then it ended. The light snapped shut like a lantern extinguished. The humming ceased. Where the brothers had stood, the stone steps were bare, save for four faint impressions burned into the granite, as though the earth itself had held them too tightly and then released. The town never saw them again. In the days that followed, arguments erupted. Some swore the boys had been taken by angels, their strange gifts a divine trial misunderstood by mortal minds. Others claimed they were never human at all, but emissaries of something vast and alien, called back to wherever they had come from. A few whispered that they still walked among the wheat fields at night, invisible, watching, waiting for the world to be ready. Professor Crow lingered only long enough to pen his final testament. His words were found weeks later, scribbled in the margins of his ruined journal. They were neither miracle nor curse, but a question the world was too fearful to answer. May history remember what science could not bear to study. By winter, Cedar Grove was abandoned. Only the churchyard remained, its steps marked by those four silent impressions, etched into stone, untouched by time, a reminder that once, in the heart of Kansas, the earth had been visited by a mystery that refused to explain itself. And in the hollow wind that swept through the empty town, some claimed they could still hear it, a faint, lingering hum,